Hello and welcome to Midnight Showing. I'm Nash, that's Luke, and this week the random movie we watched at midnight was Hugh Hudson's Revolution. Was it worth it? That's what we're here to tell you, and don't worry, we will notify you before we start spoiling it. Luke?
Nashy boy, we got a movie grounded in reality this week. That's nice.
Yeah, an interesting divergent path for us.
Yeah, Revolution, dude. I chose this movie. I had never heard of it in my entire life looking at Al Pacino movies, and I thought Al Pacino and the American Revolution, that's got to be an interesting film. And
I thought it would be a lot funnier, honestly, just because he's in it.
Yeah, right. It was not too funny. In fact, I'd say it was the opposite of funny. But let's get into the cast. So, of course, I just mentioned we got Al Pacino playing Tom Dobb, who is a okay character. We got Donald Sutherland, legend, playing Major Peasy, who's kind of a character.
He's kind of there.
This is gonna be a tough name for me to pronounce, so please bear with me. Nastasia Kinski as Daisy McConaughey, and Dave King as Mr. McConaughey. And maybe I could have put Ned in there. He's played by this dude named Dexter, but I mean, I don't really care that much.
Did you see the kid?
Yeah, the kid. Well, there's two actors for the kid, but I'm getting ahead of myself. And directed by Hugh Hudson. Nash, you know any other Hugh Hudson movies?
I really have. I know no other movie that he does.
I really don't. And I feel like.
Am I being ignorant right now?
No, I'm looking at the IMDb right now, and I'm not seeing too many.
He doesn't.
Too many movies that I know of.
He's known for Chariots of Fire, Gray Stroke, The Tortoise and the Hare, and I Dreamed of Africa.
Yeah, so we're not dealing with Christopher Nolan this week, dealing with a different guy.
But caliber.
Nash, so we're set in the American Revolution. Can you give us a little more detail on the world of this movie?
Yeah, so we start off at 1776. America is in its infancy as we are thrown into the midst of the Revolutionary War. So America is sort of divided. A quarter remain loyal to King George, and England has landed a vast armada on Long Island to crush the rebels. The Declaration has just been written. That's pretty much the starting point of the movie. The first probably 30 seconds of it, you'll pick that up. The movie, although it doesn't sort of just go through that immediate time, it goes through the entire war, following several characters across that time up until the end of the war, and when independence is actually achieved by the colonies in 1783. So that's a lot of time to cover.
It's a ton of time to cover, and you know, one of the first things I'm going to say before we really get into spoiling the movie is that I think the fact that they did that takes away from the film overall, and I wish that it just took place in a small amount of time.
Yeah, that's. I think that's a very astute observation to make.
Yeah, so we'll get into that in detail as we continue.
What kind of motifs are we looking at here?
Wait for it. Really broke the brain bank on this one. War is bad.
I wrote that note. You're welcome.
So obviously war is bad. That is kind of what we're dealing with. We're dealing with the casualties of war, what it means to be a part of a war. When a fight isn't really your fight, it doesn't matter who's fighting, it just matters who wins. And overall, it's about the idea of America, and the idea that no lord or lady is better than you. And I said lord or lady because that's the legitimate quote from the movie. That's not how I actually talk. Thank you very much. And, so that's kind of the idea of the movie, is that Al Pacino just really doesn't want to be a part of the Revolutionary War, and he gets sucked into it, and we kind of just see his journey as he is forced into a situation, a battle he doesn't want to be a part of, and how he fights for the fact that no one should be better than you, and this should be an equal country.
Yeah, and why he fights too, definitely. And most of those motifs were actually literal quotes. The war is bad wasn't.
War is bad was not a quote, but those other ones
from the movie. Yeah. All right. So before we step more into detail, let's give it our rough rating. Thumbs up or down, baby? What are you feeling this week?
I'm gonna give it a thumbs up. It's a light thumbs up. I'm not shooting to the sky, but I did like this movie.
Yeah, I'm gonna put it in the same direction. It's definitely a thumbs up. I think it's probably worth a watch. And if you've read reviews about this movie, we're gonna explain why we personally think it's probably better than a lot of those reviews have been. But now that we've sort of given you a taste, we don't want to spoil anything for anyone who hasn't seen it. So if you haven't already, like and subscribe to our channel. Pause this video so you can check this one out for yourself, because we do think that you actually should watch this movie.
I concur, friend. So, give it a second.
Bing.
If you haven't seen the movie, too late. You're already a part of this. So, Nash, dude, first thing I wanted to discuss kind of was the interesting production of this movie in terms of where it came out of. Could you tell me the backstory of how this movie was produced?
Yeah, it was really interesting, and I gotta say, because we looked this up before we started recording, because while we were both watching this movie, we noticed when they traveled outside of the New York area, they were like instantly in these crazy mountains, and we were honestly like, this looks more like the West than it does
New England.
Yeah, New England, anywhere in the Northeast of America. And when we were researching, what we found out was this was actually a British movie about the American Revolution. It was produced by, I think it was like called Goldcast.
I think it might have been Crest, but it was something like
that.
Gold
Crest, yeah. And they only were able to make the movie if they partnered with an American company, and that partnership was with Warner Brothers. So it's actually, if you're watching this movie, the way you get this the way the feel isn't, if it isn't exactly what you'd expect and you're from America, that's why. Because honestly, after knowing that, it sort of does feel like a Revolutionary War movie that's sort of like how I would imagine England explains the history of the American Revolution.
Absolutely. And in my opinion, that's one of the best things about this movie, is that it's giving us a look at something that I've heard about 1,000 times through a different lens. Because I was talking to you about it. You're a history major, so you've probably taken American history a decent amount of times. And every time that you do it, the way that they kind of teach you about it and tell you the story is that the American revolutionaries are the heroes. Because how could they not be the heroes? They're the people who made this country. And obviously, if you didn't know, Nash and I are both from America, so we learned that America is the greatest country in the world. Damn straight, baby. And so it actually turns out to be super interesting, because in the first couple scenes, you realize that, like, the revolutionaries are kind of dicks, and, like, they bully Al Pacino into a situation that he doesn't want to be in just because his kid messes up. And it was, like, jarring almost, because in the first 20 minutes, I was confused, and I was asking you, like, dude, wait, are these the British or the Americans? Because, like, I didn't think that the Americans would be treating other Americans in this bad way. You know what I mean?
No, exactly. And I think it's sort of, just because I've studied this a lot, the more I have studied it, like the sort of the more intense these sort of courses that I was in of studying American history, the more intense they were, it was sort of less that happy-go-lucky, yeah, we're fighting for independence. It's more of a reality of this is what happened. And this movie, I think, does a pretty good job of saying, like, yeah, these are things that happened. This is just sort of what happened during the war. Like, it is sort of, because I feel like when anybody talks about the American Revolution, especially if you're from America, they always have that, greatest thing ever, like, independence, and everybody was doing good, and the English were like, being real jerks.
Evil.
They deserved it.
They were the bad guys of the war, dude. They were the bad guys.
Yeah, and you look at it, it's like that motif, war is bad. All war is bad, and that sort of, I think, is a pretty good reason just off the bat to watch this movie, because I don't think there are a lot of movies about the American Revolution to begin with, and this one sort of if you haven't really studied history and you see this movie, it gives you a fresh perspective on it, because it isn't so happy-go-lucky. It's more of the grit about war.
100%, and I think that's one of the main things they were going for when they wrote the movie, was to tell it from a different lens. And so Al Pacino's character is very indifferent in this movie. He doesn't feel like the war is his fight, which is why I made that point earlier about the motif. He feels like he really shouldn't be a part of this war. He just is. And so I found it interesting, because it wasn't from the perspective of George Washington. It wasn't from the perspective of a diehard patriot. It was from the perspective of a person who was just there. And when you do it like that, it's a really human lens, and it really humanized what the war probably actually was. Everyone back in America in 1776 didn't just have a smile on their face, all giving each other knuckle pounds for getting away from the British Army. It was just people, and people act the same throughout history, clearly.
Yeah, and it was incredibly hard and sort of gritty work, and a lot of people weren't as motivated as, like, the founding fathers, who were probably more easily motivated because they had more initial things to gain from it just right off of the bat, because they, were some of the wealthiest people in the United States. George Washington and Thomas Jefferson were probably the wealthiest two people in the country.
Yeah.
So that sort of, the dynamic is different, especially because you're very often told, like, the upper echelon people, their story, because there's the most writings about it. It's sort of the common everyday people who are doing the really gritty, in the mud kind of work that you don't really hear about.
Yeah, the people who died in the war who never got a memorial because it was guerrilla warfare back in the 1700s,
Yeah, and it really does make it an interesting sort of historical fiction.
Yeah. Historical fiction,
piece.
Yeah. Well, that's a great segue, because another point I wanted to bring up to you was just kind of your personal opinion and how you feel about period pieces. For example, like, we could compare this to The Patriot, where they both take place in this Revolutionary War type time, and what it's like to watch a movie that, like, is supposed to be set in a real world place compared to, like, an original script. Like, the farthest spectrum I can bring up is talking about Zardos and talking about Revolution, because the Revolution, we know what happens at the end. America's gonna get made. Zardos, no idea what's gonna happen. It's this crazy fantasy world. So, like, what do you consider a good historical piece? What makes a piece interesting, even though we kind of know what's gonna happen low key?
It's a really interesting type of genre, because there are sort of two types of history stories that you can tell, and I really like it. The best I just off the top of my head, like a period piece, like Lincoln, with Daniel Day-Lewis, or Reverend with Leonardo DiCaprio. Like, those two movies are period pieces. They're strictly based off of the information, and everything that you're seeing in the shot is trying to be as historically accurate as possible. Where the other thing, which I honestly think is probably the most interesting and fun to watch type of movies, are, again, I like history, are historical fiction.
Yeah. And
probably, to name sort of two, probably of the most well-known historical fiction pieces, it's going to be Inglourious Bastards.
Ooh, that's a good one.
That is one of a lot of Tarantino movies, especially that last one he came up with, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood.
Mm-hmm.
Both of those movies, Once Upon a Time in Hollywood and Inglourious Bastards, they are sort of on the fringe of historical fiction, because they use the history of it just for the setting.
Yeah.
And that's all you got. The people are slightly different. Some are taken away, some are added, some are changed, to make a very compelling story that you can very easily relate to. And that's why historical fiction is so cool to me, because you don't really need to explain the world a lot. It's already based somewhat in the reality that we live in. Zardos, requires a lot of explanation, because we don't know what the hell is going on here.
And that was one of the main, sorry to interrupt, but that was one of the main plot functions that Zardos used, was that we had no idea about this world. I know about the American Revolution,
Yeah, exactly. Just to speak sort of more on kind of how Gladiator is kind of a really, really good example, because that one, it is historical fiction, but it uses real people and sort of real principles and ideals and sort of understandings of the Roman Empire to tell that story. And that, for me, is, I don't understand why more writers try to do that. Because, I mean, like, Gladiator, Inglourious Bastards, and Once Upon a Time in Hollywood are all pretty huge movies that did pretty well, and they're all historical fiction. Because the writing for that is, you're grounding the world in something everybody sort of easily knows or knows something about. Mm-hmm. You don't have to spend a lot of time explaining that. You only have to explain a few things, and you can do it in a fun and creative way. And it's much easier, I think, to show people that type of world, because they already have a general feel for it. Because everybody kind of has a basic... When you say Roman Empire, everybody sort of gets, that picture of somebody in like a white robe with the leaves on their head and stuff like that. The big pillars and obelisks and all that. Everybody sort of has that readily available information in their head already. And that's why it's such a good movie. I don't understand why you gotta make such ridiculously far-fetched movies with terrible plots, like Pearl Harbor, that movie.
Yeah.
Like, that's historical fiction. It's not based off of... It really isn't based off of Pearl Harbor. They just kind of made up most of the story for that movie, when if you actually took the real story, that I'm pretty sure the movie is based off of the book, if you actually took more of the literal interpretation of the book, it would have been a way more compelling story.
Yeah.
Like, history has a lot of things to offer that are just way more interesting than a crummy Hollywood love story that we've all seen a million times.
For sure. And so, to circle back to the movie that we're actually talking about this week, take everything Nash just said and don't apply it to Revolution, and that is where the problem lies. Because we have an interesting setting and an interesting world that not a lot of films have tackled realistically, and unfortunately it just doesn't give us enough interesting stuff to grasp onto. So as to where Inglourious Basterds or Django is like a twisted, interesting world of these topics, this movie is kind of just this topic with a ton of stuff happening. And so that's kind of like the negative side of this movie. And actually, when it came out, it did terrible in the box office, and Nash and I were looking at reviews, and a lot of people hate this movie.
They gutted it.
Yeah. And I don't hate this movie. I think that it had a lot of positives. So I kind of want to get into the positives first before we start to take it apart. So let's start at the beginning, of course. So it sets the stage, and we're right in Long Island. We're right in Long Island, and Tom Dobb comes up.
We're on the island, dude. We're not in Long Island.
We're on Long Island. I apologize. So in the first thing we see is a statue being taken down by an angry mob, and so the tone is set really quickly that we're in an unrestful place, a lot of anger going on, and the movie is really grainy and drab. It has like this interesting filter over it that kind of makes it seem like an old movie, and I think that it kind of plays into the tone really well.
We read a review that cut it apart for that aesthetic that it had, but honestly, that kind of grayish, more gloomy tone, I agree with you. I think that did fit in pretty well with the overall feeling of the movie. Like it seemed to be an aesthetic that worked in its favor rather than distracted me.
Yeah, for sure. And so, so we meet Al Pacino, and he comes up to this port on the bay where people are having this protest and tearing down the statue and whatnot. And you know, one of the best parts about this movie is like the first half hour where it's setting itself up, because we don't know that much about Al Pacino, and before we know it, the mob actually takes over his boat, which I found really interesting because, again, that plays to the point of where this is a different perspective of the American Revolution, because this mob is angry and takes over Al Pacino's boat, like, when he doesn't want them to, when he did literally nothing to them. He just pulled up to the harbor, and they just started messing with his stuff. And so, you know, we're brought into this world, and, like, within the first 10 minutes, I think it was pretty clear that it wasn't going to be like a happy picture of the revolution, your standard story. It was going to kind of be trying to give you all these themes and ideas that make you look at it in a different light. Like, it was more of just humans living life back then rather than this grand epic story of the birth of America. You know what I'm trying to say?
Yeah. Oh, exactly. It totally eliminates this sort of nobility of the event. It gets right down, you get thrown right down into the mud real quick. And he straight up gets in a fight with these people. Like, he's trying to protect his son. His son, who's a total idiot.
Total idiot. Bro, dude, do you know how pissed my dad would be at me if he just turned around and 5 minutes later I came back and I was like, oh, yo, I joined the army. I'll see you in a couple months, dude.
Yeah, it's like, where'd you get that $50, son? Oh, I joined the army. I gotta go. I know we just got here, but, you know, I'll see you. Here's $20. Have fun.
Yeah, so that's what happens, essentially, and that's how Al Pacino gets pulled into the war. Like, he really did not want to be there in any way, and his son just kind of screws him over and gets him into this thing.
And for most of the movie, he doesn't want a part of it.
Most of the movie, he doesn't want a part of it, and that's a big part of his character change, is that by the end of the movie, he sees that the British people are really just brutal, and he wants to counteract all of the negativity by killing people himself, of course, which is a little hypocritical, but we're not talking about that yet. So,
we are about to talk about killing people.
We are about to talk about killing people. I mean, what I meant to say was that, like, so we get Pacino, and he gets thrown into this situation, and they don't really tell you that much about his character, his backstory, the relationship with him and his son. We're just thrown into, like, a battle scene within, like, the first 25 minutes or so. And that first battle scene really got me excited, dude, because, like, when you start off a movie, there's always that mystery, and it's all about the way that they kind of allude to the mystery and stuff. That's why we like Zardo so much last week. Whereas this movie, like the first 40 minutes, we don't know that much about Al Pacino, and then there's a really interesting battle sequence. And let's get deep into the battle sequence. So you want to kind of try to explain why you think that this type of war translates well into film?
Yeah, especially the way they do it in this movie, like in particular, because there aren't too many Revolutionary War movies, but almost all the time when you see them in like in sort of media, if you're watching like a documentary or something, you just see, you know, shots of them, either very wide shots of like both sides lined up, or you see like one shot facing one side or the other, you know. This one, it was really interesting to watch the battle because it didn't feel rushed. It was slow, and where most people would sort of, you know, hear that and think, oh, then that's probably a bad battle scene because, you know, if you're having a battle, it's pretty chaotic. It does feel chaotic. It's just how they filmed and how they directed the British troops attacking their advance. For the majority of the fight, the British are just sort of continuously walking.
Yeah.
And it's just sort of like this just slow wave just sort of pushes over the Patriots' sort of defense, and that was really just, the camera angles were incredible on that. They had a pretty good mixture of shots, and they kept it consistent, so you sort of knew which side the camera was on. You know, that had that continuity of camera flips from one side to the other. And so it wasn't confusing. It was a very straightforward. You could clearly tell what was happening in the fighting, and you could just sort of feel sort of the power that was, I think they were trying to explain to the audience.
And it plays out like a play, almost, as to where there's one shot in particular that I found really interesting where the British are surrounding the Patriots in a half circle, and up on this little hill over here is one of the drummer boys just doing a snare drum roll, and it's like the tension is building as the snare drum kid is just playing as we watch as the British just enclose on these Patriots, and it's like kind of a trippy look because this kid is just playing the drums, watching like what's gonna happen, and it's like his dad is about to die, and he's just still playing on the drums like.
Yeah, oh yeah.
And it complements the scene really well, and it's such an interesting way to think about battle, because now we think of war in like more present times of like, I don't know, World War II, Vietnam, Iraq, that stuff, where it's kind of more like what am I trying to say? We're like, this war is like, there were rules. You were polite to people. You didn't kill the drummer boys. You didn't kill the generals. Like, that's the kind of war that we're dealing with, and that's not something you see in film a lot, and I thought it was really interesting.
And they do a really good job of sort of explaining that without literally saying it. Earlier in the movie, sort of when Al Pacino's son, you know, gets them drafted, essentially.
Yeah.
he explains to him, you stay close to the officers. Because officers in that type of war, you weren't supposed to shoot at an officer. Mm-hmm. I mean, the Americans did, because why wouldn't you? They're the one leading it. You weren't really supposed to shoot the person carrying the flag, the person drumming, or the officers, because those all gave directions to the soldiers. They weren't literal combatants. They were just sort of like the signal that was going out, as if a radio. I mean, we love to attack radios and messages now. But back then, it was sort of the rules of engagement, you know, where officers were nobility, you weren't supposed to shoot at them. It does a really good job of explaining that without hammering it down towards you. And especially later on in the movie when we see all the English drummer boys have like died, then, you know, for me as a historian, like, that's pretty cool to see, because yeah, we were shooting at them. Yeah, because they would tell the forces what to do if they were retreating. You know, if they were going forward, left, right. They were that signal that every other soldier got to know what was up.
Yeah. And it's a funny thing to think about, that people in war are following rules like it's a play. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
yeah.
Like,
yeah. Exactly.
Just like in real life, that's crazy to think that that's how they used to do it. So, unfortunately, dude, my real positives with this movie is just the action, the brutal tone, and the way that, like, they show people, and, like, these intense scenes, and the cinematography is beautiful. But underneath all that, where the actual plot is supposed to be, where the real meat of the story is, it's just not there at all. And I think that explains why a lot of people hate this movie, is just because there really wasn't anything to latch onto while we were watching the movie, dude. And there was quite a few times when you were telling me you had no idea what was going on. And that's never good for any audience member. And you and me pay dumb attention to movies because we want this podcast to be good.
Yeah.
And why are we hyper paying attention to these movies and being confused on what's happening? Maybe it's just because we're idiots, or maybe it's just because they didn't do a great job. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, exactly. And like I said, it's not like I am unfamiliar with the topic. I'm pretty well versed in it.
Yeah.
So for it to be confusing, it's more of sort of the director's issue. And that is a critique that we saw again and again in reviews that we would definitely agree with. The way it skips time, and Luke mentioned at the beginning, I don't think we saw a review that mentioned it the way Luke did. But it's probably the best way to put it, is it's so much time to focus on. It's too much for the movie.
Yeah, for real. It's way too much. And like the way that time skips are an interesting plot device, because they're kind of supposed to be used when like you want a character to get to the next level, but you don't have time to show it. So like anime is the only thing coming to my mind right now, because that's what I'm into. So like Naruto has a 2-year time skip because they just wanted to skip over all the Jiraiya stuff, and you have no idea what I'm talking about if you don't like anime. But like that's kind of what it's used for. But instead in this movie, we're just skipping around like 3 months later for no real reason. 6 months later, okay, but not that much changed. 3 years later, 3 years. 3 years is a ton of time for a war to be going on, dude. Some stuff must have happened in 3 years, and so it makes the plot kind of hard to follow, because I'm missing massive chunks of Al Pacino and his son's life. And I said earlier there's 2 actors for Ned, because in one of these time skips they skip forward so much the kid is like 5 years older.
It has to be a different person.
Yeah, and it's jarring, dude. It's really jarring.
And that really comes down to how you're doing when a time skip is done well. It's like you said, but to go a little bit further, it's sort of like the audience has gotten used to the character. They know what the character is about. They've seen them develop. They know how they react to things. Sort of, their emotional heading, if you will. Hey, if you will. Hey, I'm classy. But that sort of thing. So when that sort of thing happens, and you do have a time skip, it's not confusing, and that's why this was confusing, because we really don't know who these characters are. So, like the time skip works the best with the female lead. What was her name?
She had the hard to pronounce name. Her character's name her character's name is Daisy.
Daisy.
Much easier to pronounce.
That sounds goofy, Daisy.
Yeah,
but anyway,
it does.
Hers is sort of the most relatable, because her emotional heading is very blatant from the beginning. She's all for the revolution, even though her family is mainly against it, because they think England's going to win.
Yeah.
And so when that time skip happens and you see that she's a nurse, that makes sense. That's very believable. It's easy to follow. But the ones surrounding Al Pacino and his son, those 2 characters, it's very hard to follow, because you can't really... It's a little bit difficult to pin them down. You never necessarily know enough about them, other than Al Pacino doesn't really want to be here.
Yeah.
His son does, but doesn't understand what's going on. So that's, I think, the biggest fault of those time skips, and why it's hard to say it's a cohesive plot.
And plus, Al Pacino's whole character drive is that he's indifferent to this, and he doesn't really want to be a part of it. And so when they do these time skips, they're skipping over a ton of time that could have explained what changed Al Pacino's feelings in a better way. Pretty much what happens is the kid's feet get all torn up, and Al Pacino's angry that someone hurt his child, and that's a pretty good plot device to like make a character change. But because they skip so much time, because his character was so indifferent, it was hard to get a read on who he actually was. So when that change happened, it didn't feel supernatural. It didn't feel very like kind of epiphany moment. It was just kind of like, okay, Al Pacino's a part of the revolution now, and now he wants to do it. And that happened like an hour into the movie, and it just didn't feel like it didn't add up very well. It didn't reach that point in a very interesting way, straight up interesting. You know,
it wasn't. It didn't feel as organic as it
organic.
would be.
That's the word I was looking for. Yeah.
And I'm sort of going to go a little bit off on sort of the Patriot because there aren't. I haven't seen many revolutionary movies.
That's one of the reasons I wanted to watch this week because
Yeah.
I feel like this isn't done a lot in film.
Because we were talking about it, and it's like all the ones, all the Revolutionary War movies that have happened have been a pretty long time ago. It was like the 70s and the 80s. It's like now it's sort of the most recent one and the most well-known one that pretty much, almost every American has seen is The Patriot. And it's like...
Which, so sorry to interrupt, but quickly just note that takes place after 1812, right? Doesn't it? It's a little bit further in time than where we are right now.
No, that one is the Revolutionary War.
That one's
too.
the Revolutionary War. Okay, I made a mistake on
that. That one is after the French and Indian War.
French and Indian, my bad. I thought it was War 1812. Sorry to derail all that for no reason.
No, it's all good. It's important. It's important to understand. But that's also sort of funny that you mentioned it, just because that character, like his motivation for joining the war, we see, Mel Gibson's character doesn't want to be in the war for like the first half hour of the movie. Not until his son dies.
Yeah.
Then he's like, doesn't even really care about the war. He's just on a revenge blood path.
Yeah.
Which is, typically a plot for most Westerns. And that's why this one is sort of interesting. It's almost like you wanted to see his son die, but...
He doesn't.
He didn't. Which I honestly think is a huge plus to this movie, is that none of the main characters actually really die.
Yeah.
And it didn't necessarily feel cheesy for me. I think that's a pretty hard thing to do, and I don't think it ruined the plot. I think it actually shows how their characters make more sense in the end, because they don't really want to be a part of this war, but they are.
Yeah.
But to speak more on The Patriot, because that movie, you understand his motivation for why he's doing it. And I think there are some time skips in that movie. And so you understand where they're at because you know who those characters are. You know what their motivations are.
Yeah.
It's also really interesting why that story is so compelling is because the characters are more established. They are actually historical fiction characters. Mel Gibson's character is based off of an actual person.
Yeah.
He's spiritually related to Francis Morris. I want to say Francis Morris. His nickname was the Swamp Fox, and the kind of things that he did were exactly what Mel Gibson's character did.
That is a sick nickname, dude, the Swamp Fox.
Yeah, he just did guerrilla warfare in the swamps, and they could never catch him. Because they just didn't have the troops to actually fight him head on.
Yeah.
And so that's another reason why just historical fiction movies are just really good, because me being a history major, I really love that, because I was like, oh, I actually kind of roughly know what they're doing here. And they're using it to tell a pretty interesting story that isn't, what actually happened, but it's pretty interesting and compelling. Whereas this one, it's like you can't really sink your teeth into any of the characters, and it makes it a little bit harder to follow. But everything that's happening is pretty interesting. It's very well done. It's very well made. It's done in a way that I haven't really seen before. And so that's sort of why it's like a good movie, but I know why people said it was bad.
Yeah, we're definitely getting close to wrap-up time, so my final thought on this movie is that it's interesting in the way that it's directed, and the way that the cinematography of the movie is very interesting. There's a lot of beautiful shots. The battle scenes are super intense, brutal, but don't go into this movie thinking that it's going to change your life, and don't don't expect it to be The Patriot. If you love The Patriot and you're like, I want to watch The Patriot with Al Pacino, this isn't quite it. This isn't quite it. But it is a really interesting look on the Revolutionary War, and I think that's one of the main reasons I would recommend this movie to somebody, is that it's telling the Revolutionary War from a different perspective.
Yeah, it's not a bad perspective either. Honestly, you could probably say that the revolution itself is the main character.
Yeah, yes, 100%. The revolution is the main character.
So I guess was that your mood of the film? Like who would you sort of suggest this to?
Yeah.
That's a pretty good way to put it.
Yeah.
I'd have to say, if you like history, I think I'd watch it. especially if you're an American historian. Just because it is interesting. It isn't as grounded in reality as period pieces are, but I think it definitely sort of sheds a believable light in most cases of how things were handled. Maybe not the fox hunt thing. I don't know what the hell that scene.
That was a weird. I didn't even want to bother getting into that scene because that just kind of plays into how the plot just doesn't really follow anything because that scene is really out of place.
Yeah, it doesn't make sense.
It's not a bad movie. It's well produced. Just the story isn't there, and when the story isn't there, the movie is just not gonna do well and not gonna be memorable. And that's why I never heard of Revolution, and I'm not surprised. But check it out. I do think people should check it out.
It's a good casual watch.
Yeah, good casual watch. So, Nash, another week over, Revolution. Just got to make sure that I shout out my boy Schwartz for that beat in the beginning, and our boy Schwartz is also playing us out at the end, so please stick around to hear the beat that homeboy made. Nash, could you please end this review so kindly?
Yeah. Of course. So be sure to like and subscribe to our channel. Follow us on Instagram to stay in the loop for upcoming episodes and help us determine the movies we watch and future content that we can bring to you. Be sure to check us out at ambiguouspodcastsolutions.com, and remember, your donations keep my blue light on. See you next week as we yell about, I believe, Bronson with Tom Hardy,
directed by Nicholas Winding Refn.
Yeah, that movie's a trip. That'll be a good one.
Yeah, we're going a little forward in time, 1985 to 2008. So I'm excited to watch a more current movie next week. So we'll see everybody next week.
Peace.